All right, without further ado, Carol Witham.
Okay, do we have my slides up?
I see your slides.
Oh, perfect. Now let me rearrange a couple of windows on my desktop so that this is not so confusing. Okay, so thank you, first of all, for inviting me to do this. And I'm actually sort of excited to talk to you guys about vernal pools. It's been a while since I've given this talk, but it's certainly that time of the year to start thinking about vernal pools and where to go see them and stuff like that. So I hope that I inspire you a little bit tonight. So my talk is about the ecology and distribution of vernal pools. But if you happen to read the write-up, I always liken them to kaleidoscopes um, because they have this ever-changing pattern of color and texture. And I think that's just for those of us old enough to remember what a kaleidoscope is, I think that's an apt analogy of vernal pools. So I'm going to start us out tonight. This particular image happens to be just outside of Jepson Prairie Preserve. And here we have some vernal pools in Phoenix Park in Sacramento County. And so I'm going to start out tonight with some information about what is a vernal pool. And I'm going to start with the physical attributes. We're going to talk about what conditions give rise to vernal pools, where they're found, and approximately how many are left. And then we'll move on to biology after that. So a really simple definition of vernal pool is a depression, usually in grassland, characterized by an impermeable layer in the soil that prevents rainwater from percolating down. So it actually perches above this impermeable layer. And then the fourth really important component is a Mediterranean climate with a wet, mild winter and a hot, dry summer. So this pool happens to be near Oroville in Butte County. So the on the ground shot makes you feel like the vernal pools are separate from each other, but this aerial photograph is a very clear indication that they actually occur in these really complicated assemblages on the landscape. You can see all the vernal pools with standing water in this shot. This is in southeast Sacramento County. And so this little cartoony diagram is to sort of show you what is going on in the soil. So right in here, there's an impervious layer, and in some places it's rock. In other places, it's a consolidated hard pan, and in some places, it's actually massive clay layers. And what that does is when the rain falls, then the rain perches above this hard pan layer. And so there's this perched water table throughout the landscape. And whenever you get a depression, is when you get that expression that is the ponded vernal pool. The most interesting part of all of this is it serves as a water buffer. So as there's too much water in the uplands, it moves into the wetlands. And if there's too much water in the wetlands, it gets sucked up into the uplands. So it's part of what keeps these pools ponded in between rainfall patterns in the wintertime. So this is a stream cut in eastern Sacramento County, and the top of the hard pan is right there. And you can see that really dense cobbly layer below that and a more fluffy soil layer on top of it. And you'd think that this stream was going to cut through it, but in this particular landscape, that hard pan is about 30 feet thick. So the stream is eroding the hard pan, but it's definitely not breaching the hard pan. The hard pan here is actually caused by rainfall. Um, Rain is generally slightly acidic, and As it wets the soil, it dissolves iron and silica, which is glass, but it only wets down a certain distance in the soil because we don't get constant rain. We only get periodic rain. So, 10, 12 inches below the soil surface is where the wetting stops. And that's where the iron and glass precipitate out. And that causes this cobbly area to just cement itself solid. And so that's how you get a hard pan. So these vernal pools occur on three general geomorphic surfaces in the California region. The oldest and most abundant of these geomorphic surfaces is the alluvial terraces on the west slope of the Sierras. And these are incredibly diverse vernal pools because of the parent material that makes up the soil beneath them. So every time, a stream erodes away part of the mountain, it deposits soil. But depending on what the mineral composition was of the mountain part that got eroded away, the soils have very, very different compositions. And so these pools tend to be slightly acidic. They're extremely diverse, and they're the most abundant, and they range in age between about 200,000 years old to maybe as old as 4 million years. So this is somewhere in eastern Sacramento County. Another high terrace vernal pool in eastern Sacramento County. So the second surface that you often get vernal pools on is actually extremely young. Can everyone see the cinder cone in the background? This is Inks Creek Ranch in Tehama County. And here, the impermeable layer is actually volcanic mud flow. And it's very, very shallow underneath the soil. The soil is only inches deep. And you get vast areas of the landscape where the water just ponds in the wintertime. And so you only get minor expressions of uplands, like in the foreground here, and back over in here, you can see the grassy area. But all of the rest of this is just vernal pool vegetation. This is another volcanic vernal pool area. This happens to be at Hogs Lake in Tehama County, which is just off Highway 32. And you can see Mount Lassen in the background. So then the third geomorphic surface that you will find vernal pools on in California is intermediary in age. It's often referred to as the Basin Rim Formation, and that is literally just above the floodplains of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. So this is literally valley floor. And these are intermediary in age. They range, 40,000 years to maybe 100,000 years. And most of these vernal pools have been lost to agricultural conversion. Vast areas of the Central Valley have been converted to crops over the years. And so the Basin Rim Formation vernal pools are actually pretty rare. The other interesting thing about these is that the impermeable layer here is clay, as opposed to anything rocky. And it has a different water balance than the other types of vernal pools. And so they tend to be a little more alkaline and a little saltier. So the plant community in these vernal pools tends to be quite different. So this is somewhere near Jepson Prairie in Solano County. Another clay pan Basin Rim Formation vernal pool. This one is in Yolo County. So if you look at the Central Valley of California, you can see that at least currently, the vernal pools form sort of a ring around, bathtub ring around the Central Valley. Part of that is because the vast majority of the floor of the Central Valley has been converted to agriculture, and the most of the vernal pools occur outside of the prime agricultural areas. So the pools in this area up to about right there are the high terrace vernal pools. The volcanic vernal pools start there. There's the Sutter Buttes right there in the center. The volcanic vernal pools start about there and go up through this part of the Central Valley. And then the basin rim vernal pools are here, Jepson Prairie area, down here in basically Merced County. This is the San Luis Wildlife Refuge complex. And then farther down, Thermalito Ridge and things like that all the way down in Kern County. So this is a very old but worthwhile aerial photograph of Mather, Independence at Mather in Sacramento County. And the reason I have this up is the EPA came out with a report, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, that said that at least 75% of the vernal pools have been lost. Most of us believe the loss is closer to 90%. But the most important part of their observation was that the remaining vernal pool landscapes are highly fragmented and otherwise impacted by human activities. And I think this aerial shows that really well. First of all, you have a housing development in the center. You have mining over here. You have a golf course over here. You have runways over there. So you can see how impacted this particular gem of Sacramento County vernal pools is. And that becomes even more apparent when you look at an oblique aerial photograph of the exact same area. You can see down the center here, that's a sewage line. There's buried cables in here. There's golf course out over in there. So you can see that even though when you're on the ground here, you don't necessarily see the disturbance from the air, you can very clearly see the human impact on the landscape. So going back to my map really briefly, and I do have a more recent map, it's just that I'm only a novice at doing ArcView and I have no idea how I produced this map, and so I can't recreate it. But during the course of this mapping project, a database, a georeference database of protected lands became available for the very first time. And so we intersected the mapped vernal pool landscape with the protected areas. So the vernal pool landscape is in green, but the protected vernal pools are in pink here. And so as of our 2012 distribution, there was about 750,000 acres of vernal pool landscape remaining. Almost a third of that is actually under some kind of protection. They're not necessarily being managed for vernal pools, but they're protected from development and things like that. So this is Thermalito Ridge, so that's a wildlife refuge. San Luis and Casterson wildlife refuges. The area around UC Merced, several areas in eastern Sacramento County, Jepson Prairie in the middle there, and then a whole lot of TNC conservation easements up in here. So that gives you sort of an idea of where they are and why they're there. Now I want to talk about a little bit about why they're special. So I want to talk about whether or not they're unique, whether they're all the same. I've given you hints about that, and whether there are any extra special ones. And the only way I know how to do this is to sort of walk us through a year in the vernal pool landscape. Otherwise, I'd get confused. So anyway, so this is summer. This is up in Tehama County. Those are the Tuscan Buttes in the background. It's a pretty underwhelming landscape. It's dead, dry grass. Sometimes you can see a cow out there, but it's dead, dry grass. And most of the year, that's what the vernal pool landscape looks like. Another shot standing down inside of a vernal pool. This one happens to have rare grasses all over in it, but it's still a dead, dry landscape and very underwhelming. And it's not until you start to get a little bit of rain and it rains just enough so that you start to get a positive water balance in the perched water table and you start to get expressions of puddles on the landscape. And as soon as you get puddles, you start to get visitors. Avian visitors at Jepson Prairie Preserve, human visitors somewhere in Sacramento County, the Sacramento Splash students at Mather Field in Sacramento County. So why are we getting all these visitors? Well, one of the things you might find in the vernal pool is this egg mass of a Pacific coarse frog. Coarse frogs aren't endemic to vernal pools, but because the pools dry completely every year, they don't support fish, which are the most voracious of all of the aquatic predators. So Pacific coarse frogs and Western spadefoot toads and several other amphibians do extremely well in these habitats because they're predators. This is a microscopic photograph of a newly hatched out water flea and some diatoms. And the only reason this slide is here is while I will focus on macro animals in the vernal pools, it's a really complex food web that starts on the microscopic level. So again, this is just a newly hatched out water flea. One of the organisms you might find in a vernal pool is this really charismatic California clam shrimp. They're about the size of a dime. They have 14 legs and antenna, and they swim around in this really weird fashion, and then they get tired and they lay on the bottom of the pool and they filter feed as if they were a bivalve. And if you look at it really closely, it even has ridges on its shell that makes you think it's a bivalve, but it's actually a shrimp. Here we have a water boatman being preyed upon by a water scavenger beetle. This happens to be a rare water scavenger beetle larva, by the way. The big deal here is even though there are no large predators in a vernal pool, it's still an eat or be eaten world in there. Some other aquatic organisms, the little red jobbers are copepods. They're found in nearly every aquatic habitat in the world. There are 10 orders, 13,000 plus species. 2,800 of them live in freshwater, and most of the ones in vernal pools have not been described. The other organism you see in here is one of the most controversial of all the vernal pool organisms. This is a fairy shrimp. Fairy shrimp are controversial because although we have 27 species of them in California, 5 of them are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So there's hoops to jump through if you want to do something with a vernal pool. So this is a female California fairy shrimp, Lindariella occidentalis. You can tell she's a Lindariella because she has a red eye and red tails. You can tell she's a female by this ovisac right here. That ovisac contains hundreds of cysts or resting eggs. And I want to go off on a little tangent here. because their habitat is so ephemeral, fairy shrimp have developed a special mechanism to dealing with how ephemeral their habitat is. If you think about a chicken egg, a fertilized chicken egg, it takes about 3 weeks of nurturing before a free living organism can break out of the egg and begin to fend for itself. It starts as a single cell and it has to multiply and grow little fluff and all of that other stuff before it's a baby chick. Fairy shrimp skip that part. Each of these cysts actually contains about 4,000 undifferentiated cells. So the embryo is in the egg before the shell is put around it. The advantage here is that as soon as conditions are right, a free living organism can pop out and start to feed. Some vernal pool fairy shrimp can go from hatching from their egg to reproductive adult in days. Some of them take weeks, but there are several species that only take days. The other really amazing thing about these fairy shrimp cysts is that the coating on them is better than any polymer known to man. They have been boiled and brought back to room temperature and hatched out fairy shrimp and submerged in liquid nitrogen and brought back and hatched out fairy shrimp. There's a docent at Jepson Prairie whose high school kids collect duck poop and hatch out fairy shrimp. They've even been shot into space and returned and hatched out fairy shrimp. So it's a pretty amazing mechanism they have. And this is what they look like in the summertime. You see these little collapsed basketball looking things? They just desiccate and lay there in the sun all summer long. So a whirlwind tour of some of the endangered fairy shrimp. This is a male. This is a male vernal pool fairy shrimp or Brachynecha lynchi. You can tell he's a male by these just really awesome walrus-like claspers. The Conservancy fairy shrimp. This is a very, very rare fairy shrimp named after the Nature Conservancy. This is also a staged photograph. This shrimp usually swims in water that's about the color of a latte. The longhorn fairy shrimp, look at how different her egg sac looks, but look at how long his claspers are. Riverside fairy shrimp. And I always wondered how the riverside fairy shrimp, because it's a decent sized shrimp, it's a good 3/4 of an inch long, how it could have such bright red coloring and not be immediately preyed upon. Well, the first time I saw it in the field, I realized why. It also swims in water that is really turbid about the color and consistency of a latte. And then one of my favorite organisms is the vernal pool tadpole shrimp. This is Lepidurus packardi. This organism has not evolved since early Jurassic, probably 200 million years ago. It can get to be the size of $50. It just gets bigger, and every time it gets bigger, it sheds its shell and puffs up and makes a new shell and just goes about its merry way. It will eat anything it can get anywhere near its food groove. So I've seen this endangered species eat other endangered species. And so this is getting back to my question earlier about why there were visitors to the vernal pools. This is a really large hunk of protein. Besides waterfowl, there's ample evidence that indigenous people also ate fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. There's sites near University of California, Merced, where there are bedrock coming up out of the vernal pool, and there's a mortar hole every 18 inches. So I can't move on to spring without talking about one of the really charismatic organisms that lives in vernal pools part of the time. This is a California tiger salamander. Um, she is the fattest California tiger salamander I've ever seen. Her name is Molly, and the fifth graders at Sacramento Splash get to feed her, so she's just really fat. She lives most of her life in pocket gopher burrows in the uplands. And at about the age of anywhere between 3 and 5 years old, she will get the urge to return to her natal pond, mate, and lay eggs. They live in the wild in excess of 7 years, in captivity in excess of 15. This is a larval California tiger salamander. This one is actually pretty far along. You can see it has legs, and its feathery gills are being absorbed into its body. These are really slow and dumb organisms when they're larvae. They can't survive in waters that contain large predators such as fish. And they also need about 100 days to metamorphose. So they only occur in really large playa-type vernal pools, which is their primary breeding habitat. So in the early spring, the rains come and go, but there's a lot less. The weather starts to warm up and the pools start to dry. This is Jepson Prairie. But each geomorphic surface and soil type and the length of ponding produce a different array of vernal pool flora, and you get different displays by pool, by day of the week. They just go on and on as to the different expressions of vernal pools you can get. So this is one of my favorite shots. The University of California wanted to build their campus right there. It's way over the hill. That was one of my conservation projects of 20 years ago. So I'm going to move on now to instead of distance photos of vernal pools, we're going to do a little bit of close-up looking at vernal pools. Vernal pools have a very unique and endemic flora. Vernal pools actually occur, things that are called vernal pools, which is a very generic name, actually occur in a lot of places in the world. Only in California does it have the unique endemic flora that we think of. So there are vernal pools in Maine, and you can actually get your vernal pool certified and protected and everything else, but that's based entirely on fairy shrimp and amphibians, and there is no endemic flora. There are vernal pools in parts of the Mediterranean. I can think of Spain in particular, that have maybe a handful of plant species that grow in them, but those plant species also grow in other wetland areas. The only place that's even close to California as far as the endemic flora of a vernal pool would be the Central Valley of Chile. And there's a grand total of 16 species. In California, we've recorded over 200 plants that occur in vernal pools. Half of those only occur in vernal pools. The others tend to be typical, wetland plants that you might find elsewhere. But, there are 90 plus plants that are entirely restricted to vernal pools. A lot of those plants are common to many vernal pool areas and regions. And then there's plants that are locally and globally rare. There's also a lot of really, really cryptic species in these polymorphic genera that can drive you crazy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So this shot is actually sort of on the not down in the water part, but on the edge of the vernal pool. And I'm showing this picture because in 1869, on his second trip to Yosemite, John Muir walked across the Central Valley instead of taking a carriage. And he wrote in his journal, sauntering in any direction, my feet would brush about 100 flowers with every step, as if I were wading in liquid gold. These are probably the plants John Muir was talking about. These are California goldfields, these little jobbers, Fremont's tidy tips, and Johnny Tuck. This is a meadow foam. The entire meadow foam family is endemic to wetlands. The genus Limnanthes is endemic to vernal pools. There's a huge handful of species, several of which are listed. This one happens to be relatively common. This is Limnanthes douglasii rosea. The interesting part about Limnanthes is they produce 5 very large waxy nutlets as their reproductive strategy. And in a really, really good rainfall year, those nutlets float up into the grassland, and that's how you get these just huge swaths of white flowers that they give them the common name meadow foam. But the more interesting thing is that they're being tested for commercial production because the nutlets contain a very, very long chain oil that potentially could replace sperm whale oil for lubricating machinery. So there is a possibility that a vernal pool plant could save the whales. Meadow are also commonly used in shampoos and things like that. Another goldfield, this is vernal pool goldfield, Lasthenia fremontii. There's some little downingia tucked down in there. This is really common throughout vernal pool landscapes. However, there's some very, very cryptic species that are related to this that are federally listed. One of my favorite, common name woolly marbles, Xylocarpus brevissimus. This is a plagiobothres or a popcorn flower. Another genus with a bunch of very cryptic species, depending on your skills. You'll either delight in them or go crazy trying to key them out. A member of the mint family in the genus Pogogeny. Pogogeny is another one of those vernal pool plants that has diverged incredibly into species. In the Central Valley of California, we only have 2. You get down into the San Diego area and things like that, and there are dozens, and most of them are federally listed. So this is Sacramento beard style or Pogogeny ziziphrioides, and its relative Douglas's beard style or Pogogeny douglasii. Another really, really charming little vernal pool plant. We're down at mouse height in the pool here. This is Naviridia leucocephala, who mysteriously doesn't have a common name. The only common name I've ever been able to find for this is Nivitas, which is little snow. And so everyone I know just calls it Naviridia. There's a lot of cryptic species in this as well. There's currently a graduate student working out of Brigham Young University doing genetics on these. There are probably several new species that are kind of going to come out of that work, but there are all these little tiny white flowered, um, very, very cute members of the phlox family. Field owl's clover or Castanea campestris. Vernal pool monkey flower. I want to say mimulus, but Diplicus tricolor. And another shot of the monkey flower. And then there's an entire genus in the bellflower family that's completely endemic to vernal pools. They're the Downingia or the sky blues. This one is Downingia concolor or fringe Downingia. Folded Downingia or Downingia ornatissima. Toothed Downingia, Downingia cuspidata. Downingia bella. Downingia bicornuta. Flat-faced Downingia, Downingia pulchella. Cup Downingia, Downingia insignis. Now, all of these Downingia range in size from a dime to a quarter, except for this one, Downingia pusilla or dwarf Downingia. The real interesting thing about dwarf Downingia is there appear to be two species in California, and they're partially told apart by color, but also by how the petals are arranged. And E.L. Green definitely saw two species. They've been combined. There are people looking at whether or not they're really one or two species, but the problem is most people study plants from herbarium specimens. And so an herbarium specimen of this Downingia, the first thing you do is squash it, and then you glue it down to a piece of paper, and then you let it molder in a cabinet for years and years and years. And believe me, you can't tell the difference between the two when that happens. But one of the interesting things about this is only one of these species occurs in Chile. So it will be interesting to figure out which is which. So here is just a really, really pretty shot, again, from a mouse perspective into the vernal pool flowers. You can just see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of flowers just in this one little shot. Oops, that slide was supposed to have been hidden. This is one of my favorite rare grasses. This is Solana grass, Tectoria mucronata. It only occurs in a total of 4 vernal pools in Solano and Yolo County. And it was supposed to be hidden. I'd cut this part of the talk out. So this slide is up for just a brief discussion. There are laws that supposedly protect vernal pools. They really don't. They just regulate vernal pools. That includes the Clean Water Act, the Federal Endangered Species Act, the California Endangered Species Act, and the California Environmental Quality Act. However, these laws only really protect like the vernal pool. And it doesn't even then protect it. It just requires you to mitigate for it. But then there's all this landscape that the vernal pools incur in that a lot of consultants call non-native annual grass and say it has no value. Well, this is Jepson Prairie, and I don't know if you can see all the stipa in there, but there are tons of bunch grasses. and all kinds of flowers. And so while they're invaded a lot by non-native annual grasses, they're the last refugia for Central Valley plants that can't grow in parking lots. So included in some of the delicate little plants that grow in these grassland is spoke pods, Thysanocarpus radicans, miniature lupin, Lupinus bicolor, purple Navaredia, Navaredia pubescens, blowwives. The flower is really small and underwhelming, but when these things are in seed, they're just beautiful. California golden violet, Viola pedunculata, narrow-leaved mule's ears, Wyethia angustifolia. This is Brodea multiflorum, and I can't think of a common name for it, but it's very pretty Brodea. Brodea coronaria, crown Brodea. Yellow Mariposa tulip, Calochortus luteus. So this is, hang on a second, go lay down. Twerp. I'm sorry, I have a cat annoying me. So this is a vernal pool in Grassland State Park, which is along Highway 165 in Merced County. And if you've never been there, it's really worth a trip in the spring. This is a relatively large vernal pool. I was here in the early 2000s with the Michael Barber group that was studying vernal pool vegetation. And so we had been collecting data on this pool all day. So we knew the cover, we knew how big the pool was, everything else. So over cold beverages that evening, we sat down with a napkin and calculated out that this Downingia in here, this purple flower, and this is only part of the pool, but this purple flower in here, Downingia pulchella, we figured out that in this single pool, there were 25 million Downingia blossoms. So that was pretty impressive. And I didn't even have time tonight to talk about why they all bloom in synchrony. That's for another evening. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carol. There's some questions that showed up in chat. Do you want to read through them, or would you like me to read through them and have you answer them?
Why
And then
don't
also,
why don't we do it just sort of as a group? If you could read the question, I would be happy to try and answer them.
okay. First question, what causes the upland areas mima or mimas? Is it wind?
Um, okay, so vernal pool is very a generic term that means spring petal. Mima mound is also a very, very generic term, and it's used to describe a whole slew of different phenomena that cause these. Sometimes if you get out in the desert, you have a shrub, the wind blows the sand up on the shrub, and you get a mound. You get up into the permafrost areas, and the shrink swell of the soils can cause mounds. The same with Gilgai formations down in Australia, where you get big cracks in the soil during the summertime, and wind blows particles down into the crack. And then when the soils waterlog again, those cracks have more soil than they need, and so they form little puffs. Some people say that they were caused by gophers, and there's some evidence that gophers maintain them. um, that over time they would erode away flat if it weren't for gopher activity that brings soil from the edges back into the center of the mound. So there's probably more theories as to what causes Mima mounds than there are people who study them. How's that for non-answer?
That's a pretty complete non-answer. Debbie asks, how old are the vernal pools in Orange County? And she calls out vernal pools in Fairview Park and Randall Preserve.
So those are on marine terraces, is that correct? That's my recollection. Um, those are probably relatively young, in the tens of thousands of years old.
Tens of thousands.
They're on coastal bluffs.
Okay, they may be a little bit older than that then if they're on coastal bluffs instead of marine terraces, but um, the the way California was formed, that's still relatively young area out there compared to stuff like the ancient Sierra Nevadas.
Will cropland ever revert back to vernal pools, or can vernal pools be restored actively?
Um, I've seen areas that are plowed on a fairly regular basis, that shallow plowed and planted in wheat and stuff like that. And if they don't crop it for a year, you end up getting some manifestation of a vernal pool back. Um, can you restore them? People say yes. I'm not convinced. Given how old these are, I'm just not sure that we can do a good job of it. If you're creating them because you have to mitigate for something, and your mitigation is it has to grow fairy shrimp, well, then you can make a puddle that grows fairy shrimp, but it's not necessarily a vernal pool.
Right. Melanie appreciated your quote from about walking across the Central Valley.
Oh, it's one of my favorite John Muir quotes.
Yeah. Do any of the vernal pool endemic plants make good garden plants?
There,
I had goldfields once, but they were not persistent.
part of the reason they weren't persistent is because goldfields in particular have a mutual relationship with a ground nesting solitary native bee. And so if you don't import the pollinator when you plant the plants, you aren't going to get reproduction. Um, a couple of them make okay garden plants. The ones that tend to grow in the fringes of the vernal pools make better garden plants than the other ones. I know people who grow like limnanthes, and I've had patches of goldfields go for quite a while. And the tidy tips, which is also sort of a mesic grassland species, grow fairly well. But otherwise, unless you're really willing to like actually build a vernal pool and make sure that um, it ponds and everything every year, you're not going to get persistent flowers.
All right. There's some complimentary messages. And then there's a question on clarifying the definition of hard pan. Maybe you could review that.
Sure. So a hard pan is just basically a place where the subsoils are consolidated enough that it keeps the water from percolating down through the soils into the water table. And in most cases, those hard pans are a combination of volcanic ash, which is mostly glass, and iron, which is mostly from the soil. And that consolidates a rocky area into making it a hard pan. And sometimes the hard pans can be really shallow, and sometimes they can be really thick. But basically, the term that Bob Holland uses is aquitard, which is just something that it's a layer that keeps the water from moving through it. And so that's basically what a hard pan is.
Yeah, there's more accolades in the chat, but no more questions. Are there any questions in the audience that someone might want to ask? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Carol.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate a good audience. So
Oh,
thank you very much.
oh, we did have one last question trickled in. Do vernal pools in coastal bluffs have any significant differences from those that you described?
Um, yeah, they tend to have a very different soil chemistry. So the plants tend to be in the same genera, but the different species. They're more salt tolerant, they're more alkali tolerant. Um, and the few coastal bluff areas I have visited numerous times, I have always blown me away in that they don't always get enough rainfall to pond and can go years without ponding. But then as soon as they pond, they're suddenly vernal pools again. And that is something about the coastal bluff vernal pools that I just find fascinating.
All
So
right.
the seed bank lives for a very long time and it just needs the right conditions.
Are there any tips you have on locating our LA local vernal pools? I know we have some at the Madrona Marsh, which is in
Yeah,
Torrance.
I'm not as familiar with in fact, at one point in time, I was talking to Angel about maybe coming down for your field trip to go look at vernal pools. I'm not as familiar with your area as I should be. The summer or the spring that we did a lot of work in that particular area of California. I had my mom in and out of the hospital kind of thing. And so I got to visit some of the pools down there, but not very many of them. So I don't have as in-depth a knowledge of your area as I'd like to.
All right. We have a spare bedroom, so you're welcome anytime.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I think that draws the meeting to an end. So thank you again, Carol. I'm
Thank
going to
you.
stop the recording now.